The Young and the Restless spoilers Fridays full October 3, 2025. The storm that had been brewing quietly in Genoa City finally threatened to break wide open as Michael Baldwin's restlessness, Lauren Fenmore's desperation, and Victor Newman's inscrutable maneuvers all collided with Jack Abbott's calculated moves. For weeks, Michael had struggled with the suffocating emptiness of retirement, the gnawing hunger to remain relevant, and the pull of temptation that Kane Ashby's lingering presence stirred within him. He had sworn to Lauren that he was done with backroom deals and dangerous alliances, but the man who once thrived on intellectual battles and high-stakes negotiations could not resist the call of conflict. And now, he was inching ever closer to betraying the fragile peace of his marriage. Lauren, exhausted by the weight of his obsessions and terrified of losing him to old habits, found herself standing on the edge of a devastating decision, to finally walk away. For years, she had forgiven Michael his lapses, his compromises, and his excuses, but this time felt different. This time, his loyalty seemed torn not only between her and his work but between her and Victor Newman, the one man who had always wielded far too much influence over him. Michael's crisis deepened when he revealed to Victor the details of his dealings with Kane. It was an admission laced with both guilt and calculation, because Michael knew that Victor would interpret it not as a confession but as an opportunity. Kane was a dangerous variable, unpredictable, and Victor's instinct was to control or eliminate variables. Yet Michael was not simply handing Victor information, he was offering himself back into the game, indirectly begging for a role in the war. Just as he had feared, Jack Abbott entered the picture at precisely the wrong, or perhaps the right, moment, depending on perspective. Jack confronted Michael head-on, bluntly asking whether he was friend or foe, a question that struck Michael at his core. His baffled response, why were two lifelong enemies suddenly working together, exposed just how deeply out of step he was with the shifting alliances around him. Victor and Jack, bound by their shared determination to crush Kane, had managed the unthinkable, a fragile truce. To Michael, this was a paradox. To Victor and Jack, it was temporary strategy. And to Kane, if he discovered it, it would be war. The alliance, however, was far from solid. Jack and Victor fell into old habits almost immediately, bickering over control and mistrust even as they admitted the necessity of working together. Michael, in a rare moment of clarity, suggested that they either stand united as a cohesive force or accept that their endless feud would hand Kane the victory by default. His words rang true, but Jack and Victor were not men inclined to share power easily. Still, Michael's presence made them hesitate, for if nothing else, he reminded them of the stakes. Jack pressed his advantage by revealing that he had already spoken with Jill Abbott, whose connections and influence over Kane could not be ignored. Jill, Jack argued, would stop at nothing to keep Kane from rising unchecked, and her involvement could tilt the balance in their favor. Victor, ever the stoic tactician, responded with a measured grimace, refusing to reveal his true commitment. His cryptic assurance that time would tell once Jill arrived did nothing to soothe Jack's suspicions or Michael's unease. While Michael wrestled with his role in this dangerous alignment, Lauren's patience finally began to shatter. Distraught and suspicious, she confided in Nikki Newman, desperate for clarity. Her questions pierced straight to the heart of her fears. Had Victor pulled Michael back into his orbit, and was that why her husband seemed once again entangled with Kane's chaos? The thought that Michael might be secretly working for Victor, betraying their vows for another taste of power and purpose, was unbearable. Nikki, ever caught in the delicate balance between loyalty to Victor and her empathy for other women, offered only guarded answers. She admitted she did not know the full truth, but she reminded Lauren of a reality that both comforted and terrified her. Michael and Victor might quarrel, they might even fall out, but their bond was unbreakable. It was as though Michael had become Victor's surrogate son, a man Victor had tested, shaped, and bent to his will over the years. That kind of bond was not easily severed, no matter how many times Michael claimed independence. To Lauren, those words landed like a blow, for they confirmed what she had always feared, that she was not simply competing with Michael's ambition, but with Victor himself. As all of this unfolded, the stage was set for a collision of personal and professional stakes. Jack, wary yet determined, tightened his plans with Jill as an ally. Victor, secretive and calculating, prepared to use both Jack and Michael until they no longer served his purpose. Michael, trapped between his craving for relevance and his devotion to Lauren, risked everything by playing both sides of the board. And Lauren, tired of standing in the shadows of powerful men, considered whether walking away was the only way to save herself. Nikki, meanwhile, found herself in the unenviable position of interrogating Victor about his intentions, pressing him with questions that could either expose his schemes or fracture their marriage yet again. Her instincts told her that Victor's alliance with Jack was temporary, a facade masking his true plan to punish Jack when the time was right. And if Michael was indeed caught in the middle, then he, too, would become both pawn and casualty. In Genoa City, trust was always fragile, and loyalty was currency more valuable than gold. As Victor and Jack plotted in uneasy tandem, as Michael balanced on the edge of temptation, and as Lauren contemplated abandonment, one truth stood stark against the backdrop of manipulation: this was not just a war against Kane Ashby. It was a war for identity, for love, for control of one's destiny in a world where every alliance carried a hidden knife. For Michael Baldwin, the choice was clear but brutal: cling to Lauren and the promise of peace, or surrender to the irresistible pull of conflict, where Victor Newman's shadow loomed ever larger. Lauren Fenmore had reached the breaking point, her patience eroded by years of compromise and the endless tug-of-war between Michael Baldwin's promises and his compulsions. Her voice, usually so measured, trembled with a mixture of fury and heartbreak as she demanded to know why her husband could be so cruel to her. Why he could stand by Victor Newman, follow his lead, and allow their marriage to wither beneath the weight of lies and secrets. Nikki Newman, drawn into this storm by her own uneasy conscience, tried to comfort her but could not deny the bitter truth. She pointed out that this pattern was not unique to Michael, it was the same cycle she had endured with Nicholas and Adam, Victor's sons, who had always found themselves either colliding with or submitting to their father's power. Victor demanded loyalty, and once a man fell into his orbit, it was nearly impossible to break free. To Lauren, this was no excuse, it was an indictment. Her bitterness poured out as she accused Nikki herself of being complicit, of standing by silently while Victor crushed Jack Abbott and reshaped alliances to suit his ego. "You let it happen," Lauren spat, her frustration spilling over. "You knew what he was doing, and you chose to ignore it." Nikki, visibly shaken, admitted that she had begged Victor to let this go, to avoid another round of retaliation and manipulation. But Victor had only given her silence, the kind of silence that masked 1,000 calculations. For all her years with him, Nikki knew she could not stop him once his mind was set. Lauren confessed then what had been gnawing at her: she was sick of Michael's endless devotion to Victor. Sick of watching her husband's loyalty bend toward a man who seemed to consume every ounce of independence Michael had left. "I had him," she whispered, a line that revealed more pain than anger, "and I know he misses Victor. But I thought he could get past it. I thought he could move on with me." Instead, Kane's return had reignited everything, undoing the fragile progress they had made. With Kane's shadow looming, Michael's resolve had crumbled, and the same old patterns had returned. Desperate, Lauren turned to Nikki and asked her to find out once and for all if Michael was working with Victor, because the uncertainty was tearing her apart. True to her word, Nikki returned to Newman Enterprises, her face a mask of determination as she confronted Victor directly. "Is Michael working with you?" she asked him, her tone sharper than usual. Victor, as always, chose evasion over honesty. He dismissed the question, shifting focus, sidestepping with the subtle deflections of a man who had built his empire on secrets. Nikki saw through it. She knew Victor was hiding something, but his refusal to give a clear answer told her everything she needed to know. Later, unsettled but unwilling to keep Lauren in the dark, she placed a call. On the other end, Lauren sat at a quiet table at the athletic club, dining with Michael, her demeanor brittle but composed. Nikki's words struck her like cold steel. Victor had not confirmed anything, but her instincts told her Lauren was right. Something was happening between Victor and Michael. Something dangerous. I can feel it, Nikki confessed. There's more going on than he admits. Lauren ended the call, her heart pounding, the words reverberating in her chest. She turned to Michael, her eyes blazing with betrayal, and the mask of composure she had worn through dinner finally shattered. Once again, you've lied to me, she said, her voice cracking with hurt. Michael tried to defend himself, insisting he had not concealed anything, that he had spoken to Victor only about infiltrating Kane's operation. But even that confession stung. The fact that Victor remained a part of his calculations, that he was still drawn into schemes despite being fired by Kane, made it clear that Michael could not walk away. To him, it was nothing, just meaningless talk, a thread of strategy that had gone nowhere. To Lauren, it was proof that the cycle never ended. Kane had dismissed him, yet here he was still tethered, still chasing the thrill, still leaning on Victor as though his loyalty to that man outweighed his vows to her. This will never end, she whispered, her despair heavier than anger. And then, with the finality of a woman who had no more words, no more patience, and no more faith, she stood and walked away. The sound of her heels echoed through the club as Michael sat frozen, realizing that in his pursuit of relevance, in his refusal to sever ties with Victor in the dangerous games of Genoa City, he had lost the one anchor that had always grounded him. Lauren was gone, leaving him to face the truth, that his obsession had cost him not just her trust, but possibly her love forever. The conversation in the park began as a sparring match and quickly revealed itself as something far more elemental, a collision of wounded pride, protective instinct, and the slow-burning inertia of old betrayals that had not yet cooled. Kyle sat across from Clare, the afternoon sun cutting through the trees and throwing patterns of light and shadow across his face, and he spoke with that familiar mixture of hurt and righteous anger that had become his armor. He warned her about Holden Novak, calling him a player, a name that in Kyle's mouth carried the weight of every slight and deception he'd ever endured. Clare, who had grown more ferocious and more fragile in equal measure since the days when Jordan and past trauma had defined her, met his accusation not with tears but with an immediate, almost defensive logic. She asked why it had to be a man in Los Angeles, why it couldn't be a girlfriend she saw for company, as if the accusation itself, Kyle's assumption that she must be romantically involved, was a small wound that cut into her autonomy. What, is that how it is? Kyle pressed, and Clare replied with a knock of irony that cut deeper, that's none of your business. Her answer was at once a refusal to be policed and a refusal to entertain his bitterness. She was not going to let Kyle convert her curiosity into guilt by default. Kyle's voice rose then, not just in volume but in stakes. He insisted that Holden's invitation to Los Angeles was not an accident, that there was an agenda and Clare had naively stepped into it. Clare tried to frame the trip on her own terms, a tour, an adventure, not a romantic escape to be staged under the French light in someone else's dream. She told him bluntly that she would not sit on his train carriage in France, a gesture that was both practical and symbolic. She would not abide by arrangements that locked her into someone else's expectations. Kyle, stung by the implication that she could have similar experiences with him and had chosen not to after he had betrayed her trust, accused her of wanting to be part of a plot to humiliate or provoke. This is to get revenge, he said, choosing the word with the old, wounded clarity that had sustained his anger long after his love had faded. Clare's retort was sharp and immediate. He was hypocritical, he had been cruel in the past, and his pride, his need to be right and to punish rather than to reconcile, had corrupted him more than any of Holden's supposed thrills ever had. She defended Holden as a friend and insisted this trip was about self-discovery. She wanted to live and to learn about herself outside the orbit of Genoa City's expectations and the repetitive cycles that had defined her life for too long. That was when the tensions in the park widened into a tableau of observation and opportunism. Audra Charles, who had once burned bridges and rebuilt them on shifting moral ground, was within earshot and chose, for reasons she would later articulate in colder terms, to listen rather than to intervene. Audra's presence was itself a statement. She had history with Holden, and her past decisions, lines crossed, loyalties leveraged, meant that her silence was an act of choice that carried consequence. As Kyle's invective toward Holden gained momentum, he painted Holden as unscrupulous, someone who had ulterior motives for inviting Clare away, Audra sat beside him like an accomplice of circumstance, nodding inwardly at each insinuation. Kyle's accusations were barbed with personal history. He accused Holden of being part of a strategy to hurt Clare and by extension to challenge Victor Newman's control over the city's emotional economy, and Audra's reaction betrayed something more sinister than mere agreement. She understood leverage when she saw it, and Victor's ghost, figurative though ever-present, hovered over her thoughts. When Kyle finally declared, in a moment of bitter theatricality, that Victor would be proud of the way his family was being vindicated, Clare cut through him with candor. She called him self-righteous and accused him of using her life as a stage for his own revenge fantasy. The exchange ended with Clare walking away, leaving Kyle to simmer in the shadow of his own making on the park bench. What happened next was the quiet, careful arithmetic of manipulative ambition. Audra, who had moved from simply eavesdropping to the active deployment of her gains, took Kyle's raw pain and reframed it as evidence of a successful strategy. She had always been adept at turning moments of emotional exposure into currency, and now she saw the opportunity to exploit Kyle's wounded pride for a promised return. "This is a difficult time for a man who's been dumped by a psychotic girlfriend," she said, her tone glazed with cruelty that would be rationalized later as survival, as necessary cunning in the games people played for power and position. She reminded Kyle that Victor had been right about him all along, a statement designed to wound and to align Kyle's sense of self with Victor's approval that came at the cost of betraying his own heart. Audra's revelation was that she had been executing Victor's plan to demonstrate that Kyle was unworthy of Clare. She expected, perhaps even demanded, that Victor honor his side of an unstated bargain. She wanted her reward, recognition, compensation, a tangible return for serving Victor's interests by sowing discord between Clare and the man she loved. Audra's maneuver was not merely selfish, it revealed the tangled loyalties that defined many relationships in Genoa City, where affection and ambition often braided together until they were indistinguishable. Kyle's reaction to Audra's confession was incandescent. He refused, with the narrow stubbornness of a man who believed in some residual honor, to let Audra profit from the damage she had orchestrated. He would not be made into a stepping stone for someone else's ascent. His vow to bring her down was less about personal vengeance than about reasserting a moral claim over the wreckage she'd helped produce. If Audra and Victor intended to manipulate people like him, he swore he would not be their instrument without fighting back. In his fury, there was also a brittle vulnerability. He loved Clare. His identity had been constructed around the hope of her return. To lose her again because of machinations that stripped choice away from both of them felt like a betrayal not only of their relationship but of his own self-conception. Kyle's anger was paradoxical because it both exposed his impotence and sharpened his resolve. He would use the same tools as his enemies: strategy, alliance building, public exposure, if necessary, but he would try to keep the moral upper hand by calling out deceit where he saw it. Across town, this park confrontation had implications that rippled outward because none of these characters existed in isolation. Clare's insistence on adventure and self-discovery was not merely youthful defiance, it was an act of reclamation after being molded and harmed by forces beyond her control. To her, Holden represented a way out of narratives that had been imposed on her since childhood, an opportunity to make decisions without being the passive object of some revenge plot or paternal manipulation. Kyle's disdain for Holden was therefore not just an expression of jealousy or wounded pride, it was a defense of the known world, imperfect as it was. He feared the unknown because it could destabilize what little stability he had left. Audra, by contrast, had transformed personal needs into strategic currency. She saw relationships as networks to be exploited for gain because that was how she had learned to survive. Victor's unseen hand, his promise, his influence, and his future expectations hung over everything like the weather in Genoa City, changeable, often violent, and always threatening to ruin the harvest of anyone who stayed out too long in the open. If there was a moral core to the episode in the park, it lay in the discomforting truth that love and power in Genoa City were never purely sentimental, they were instruments that could build or destroy. Clare's desire to find herself and to step away from a past that had defined her was noble and dangerous in equal measure. Kyle's pushback, moralizing, possessive, and sometimes cruel, came from a place of wounded protection as much as from ego. Audra's opportunism, which she framed as justified retribution or rightful reward, exposed the rot that comes when people trade intimacy for advantage. The scene, simple, human, devastating, was a microcosm of the larger dynamics at play.